tonight, not in bad weather. We're very glad to have you here. I'm Dr. Philip Vogt. I'm an associate professor of history here at Lawrence Tech. I'll be on the panel tonight and moderating it. Let me start by introducing you to the other panelists. On my right is Dr. John Ciocciari. Dr. Ciocciari earned his bachelor's degree and his Juris Doctorate from Harvard and his PhD from Oxford. He is assistant professor of public policy and co-director of the International Policy Center at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. His interests include international law, politics, and international finance. His current research projects focus primarily on the Asia-Pacific region and examine foreign policy strategies, human rights, and the reform of international economic institutions. He has served as a National Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and as a Schoenstein Fellow at the university's Asia-Pacific Research Center. From 2004 to 2007, he served as a policy official in U.S. Treasury Department's Office of International Affairs. Since 1999, he has been a legal advisor to the Documentation Center of Cambodia, which promotes historical memory and justice for the atrocities of the Pol Pot regime. His book, The Limits of Alignment, Southeast Asia and the Great Powers Since 1975, investigates the power alignments of small and middle states in Southeast Asia. To my left is Dr. Yumin Sheng. Dr. Sheng is an associate professor of political science at Wayne State University. He joined the department in 2005 after obtaining a PhD in political science from Yale. His research interests are globalization and domestic politics, federalism and decentralization, and regional political representation and resource redistribution under authoritarianism with a focus on contemporary China. His book, Economic Openness and Territorial Politics in China, is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. His recent work has also appeared in British Journal of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Contemporary China, Studies in Comparative International Development, and the China Quarterly. Me, I'm an early modern Europeanist specializing in history of philosophy in the early modern period with an interest in Hobbes and Thucydides. Okay, please welcome. I thought what I would do is start with just the briefest explanation of what the so-called Thucydides trap is, all right? This is, as I understand it, an idea developed by Graham Allison and the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School. They've begun what they call the Thucydides Project, which is a project to track instances of conflict between ruling powers and rising powers that threaten to displace them. And the idea is a suggestion that they have examined 16 cases in the last 500 years and found that 12 of those did in fact lead to war. So the question is, is there in fact an inevitability of war first diagnosed by Thucydides in his History of the Peloponnesian War? Now, I thought that since we have in our exhibit a first edition of Hobbes's translation of Thucydides, I would read to you quickly the relevant passage. In this passage at the beginning of the book, Thucydides is talking about uncanny events in nature that preceded the outbreak of fighting between Athens and Sparta. He talks about unusual earthquakes, different prodigies of this sort, and he says, discussing the cause of the war, the truest quarrel, though least in speech, the truest quarrel, though least in speech, I can see to be the growth of the Athenian power, which putting the Lacedaemonians into fear, necessitated the war, right? Necessitated, but in this translation it's not inevitable. But the causes of the breach of the league publicly voiced were these, and then he goes on to discuss the history of the war itself. In a different edition, translated by Rex Warner, the language is, let's see, but the real reason for the war is, in my opinion, most likely to be disguised by such an argument, the argument about supernatural elements, etc. What made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. Okay, so I think that we'll have lots of topics to touch on, some from the ancient world, some from today, and because we're drinking, I'm going to set this out of the way. And John, would you like to start?
Sure. I'll pick this up in case it's helpful to some for hearing me. Sorry? Okay. Let me pull this out. Thank you all for coming. Very nice to meet you. I will start with a few comments on putting the Thucydides trap or the Thucydides project in context of how international relations scholars tend to think about these things in a contemporary context. That is to say, whether or not the rise of China vis-a-vis a status quo power like the United States makes conflict inevitable. Graham Allison, the professor who Professor Vogt mentioned, is most famous for having written a book that everybody studies who does foreign policy called Essence of Decision about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in that book, where it was a departure from pre-existing international relations theory, is that Allison says there are three different ways that you can think about explaining behavior of a government in a crisis like the Cuban Missile Crisis of October '62. Number one, you can look at it as a process defined by decisions by rational actors. The United States, led by Kennedy, playing basically a chess match against Khrushchev's Soviet Union. And each side responds to the other in rational ways. I'll explain in a minute how this rational actor theory becomes sort of the thread of IR theory, international relations theory, that can lead us to this deterministic vision of a Thucydides trap. But the other two models that Allison is famous for drawing our attention to are Model 2, which is about bureaucratic competencies and routines and procedures. For example, what kind of intelligence capabilities did the United States Air Force and Navy have to be able to ascertain what the Soviets were doing in Cuba? What was the set of rules of engagement that applied when the United States implemented a quarantine around Cuba in order to prevent further shipments of Soviet goods to that communist-ruled island? And how these bureaucratic procedures, rules, habits of practice could lead to outcomes that would be quite different than what one might expect of a rational actor trying to maximize benefits vis-a-vis costs in this sort of chess match with the Soviet Union. And the third model is about internal bureaucratic politics, the idea that any decision that Kennedy made or that Khrushchev made would be, in essence, having to take into account and compromise among various domestic interests. And so maybe the Defense Department was more hawkish, and some of you may have seen the movie 13 Days, which really plays up the difference between the defense establishment and the civilian leadership in the State Department and elsewhere. So maybe the diplomats are dovish, and maybe the military is hawkish, or vice versa, and the leader, in this case Kennedy, has to equilibrate in some way between those various pressures. I mention that because I think that getting into those second and third models that Allison is so famous for describing to us and analyzing helps us understand some of the ways in which the rise of China doesn't deterministically lead to war with the United States. But let me project forward to another famous work in international relations scholarship that tends to feed into the sense that this could be deterministic, and that is an equally famous book called A Theory of International Relations, published in A Theory of International Politics, rather, published in 1979 by a Berkeley professor named Kenneth Waltz. He's famous for a theory that's often referred to as structural realism. And structural realism makes the following analogy. Imagine that you have a leaf that falls from a tree. The leaf doesn't necessarily, at any given point in time, if we train one of those cameras on the leaf, it may not necessarily be falling toward the earth. It may be going horizontally. It may even get a gust of air that pushes it up. But the general tendency will be for the force of gravity to bring the leaf to the ground. And what Walsh argues is that in an international system, if the following two premises are true, if A, it's an anarchical system, which is to say that nation states are the primary actors and there's no global policeman or no supranational government that can bind the behavior of the most powerful states. And number two, if states therefore are conditioned to prioritize above all else their own security and safety, then the nature of that system, like force of gravity, provides incentives or impels states or their leaders to make decisions that are power maximizing strategies, or at a minimum that try to prevent another possibly threatening power from developing superior capabilities. In the structural realist reading of international politics, then the Thucydides trap is a very real risk as China rises against the United States, because the structural realist account of international affairs draws our attention to the fact that there can only be one most powerful country, and that the nature of the anarchical system means that if the United States, even if the United States thinks China is a benign power today, it needs to fear the possible change in Chinese intentions in the future, and therefore will take the kinds of measures that Thucydides describes in the Peloponnesian War, history of the Peloponnesian War. In other words, the United States, fearful that China will misuse its accumulated power in the future, takes steps that China then perceives as threatening, and you get into what international relations theorists call the security dilemma, or a spiral of insecurity, as both sides see the other one's intentions as offensive, but each side perceives its own intentions as defensive, right? So this is the sort of position that this argument occupies in the international relations literature, that one not need be a maniacal leader to take actions that lead to a spiral of hostilities. One only need to be rationally responding to a structure of international politics that's fundamentally anarchical, and in which the assumption is made that that leaders of great powers tend to want to forestall challenges to their primacy. I have lots of comments on why I think this is why there are limitations to this approach, and why I don't think that it's necessarily going to lead to war between China and the U.S., but I just wanted to situate it in that way.
Thank you everybody for coming out, but really enjoyed John's lucid exegesis of the different schools in international relations. It's been a while since I took my comp in international politics, basically I just agree. It's, these are the leading theories that, especially the structural theory in international politics proposed by Kenneth Waltz, that would lead us to predict some kind of inevitable conflict between China and the United States as China's power rises, while the status quo, the hegemon, the reigning hegemon, the United States might, take preemptive action to ensure its continuation of, as the reigning hegemon in the global system. So that's that's the kind of the leading theories, but of course there are other arguments that would probably point to other predictions, so it's kind of interesting that Graham Allison is doing this Thucydides trap kind of a project. I'm kind of not extremely familiar, but with his other writings, but I know about the book, The Essence of Decisions on the Cuban Missile Crisis, which basically says, it's kind of an internal bureaucratic politics that explains a lot of foreign policy decisions. But at the same time, he, in his new project on the Thucydides trap, dealing with China's rise under American hegemony, he seems to be drifting toward a structural kind of a pessimism, in saying that conflict seems inevitable, and a lot of things make sense, but I also have some reservations about those arguments, which we can talk about later.
Can I ask a question of you? So you talked briefly about the idea that bureaucracies within states are also players. In Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, the war is not just fought between Athens and Sparta, it's fought within Athens and Sparta. So with Greek stasis, with the class tension between states, virtually every Greek city has a pro-Athenian democratic party and a pro-Spartan aristocratic party, right? I've noticed in history that sometimes a state in warfare will be sabotaged by Harlan generals, by a faction of her own society who would profit if the state would lose. Does that make sense? Now, I don't think we're just talking about bureaucracies then. We're talking then about fundamental ideological rifts within the state, right? So I guess one question that occurs to me, I'd like to know more about contemporary China. What, if any, are the serious ideological rifts? Are there, is there a pro-democracy movement in China, not pro-democracy, but pro-Western movement of sufficient strength that it would play a role in shaping whether or not we go to war with China? What would you say to that?
I'll offer brief comments. I think Yuman is certainly more expert than I am on Chinese domestic politics, but the short answer is that yes, there are, of course, significant constituencies within China that are pro-democratic, that identify more with Western liberal norms of civil and political rights, that a growing number of Chinese who are Christians, some underground, some in the quasi-shadows with official complicity, and certainly a very, very large constituency in China that is heavily invested in trade and other mercantile relations with the United States. There are also large ethnic minority groups in China that are not friendly at all toward the Communist Party, whether that be Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, whether it be Tibetans, but also others. And so China is dauntingly complex in terms of its internal social and political diversity, which means that it is very possible that in the event of escalating interstate conflict between China and the United States, that the Chinese government would not have universal domestic support for its actions. The same, of course, is true in the United States, but it is possible to imagine scenarios in which constituencies inside of either country could have a very different set of interests and preferences than their government in the event of an interstate conflict. In the U.S., you might say that you could easily imagine a split between the, for lack of a better term, the sort of the business class of people who are invested in a strong trade relationship with China and other constituencies that might be more inclined to take a hawkish view toward China. Interstate dispute is one example.
Okay, can I just speak without the microphone? I think now that Phil mentioned the role of democracy, just reminds me of one recent theory. That's actually a criticism of the realist, structural realist theory. The so-called democratic peace theory in international relations, which says, democracies don't fight each other, but democracies fight dictatorships, and dictatorships fight dictatorships, and which actually, adds, basically adds to the argument, the structural prediction of inevitable conflict between the United States and China, just because China is still ruled by a communist dictatorship, and while the United States, of course, has been a democracy. And so the question is, since China is non-democratic and still trying to rise to challenge the hegemony of the United States, and as a result, conflict is even more inevitable. So then now the question is, how about the democratic elements, pro-democracy elements in China? To be sure, there are there have always been dissidents in China, and intellectuals, independent labor movements, etc. But currently, actually under the new president, Chinese authorities are actually tightening its grip on possible dissidents, so many of these people, human rights lawyers, people with grievances who try to kind of showcase, or just let the world know about their kind of unhappiness with the Communist Party. These people are being silenced, and so I'm not sure kind of what role these people will play in case of a conflict with the United States. And at the same time, it's been many years since 1989 when the students rose up to challenge the communist dictatorship. And so now the question is, what happened to these other people? The rising Chinese middle class, are they pro-democracy, or are they kind of more complicit with the communist dictatorship? Because you see, because of in fact, I've been looking at some recent research, survey research on Chinese public perception of the importance of democracy versus political stability in light of the Arab Spring and the fiasco in Syria and Iraq, and Egypt and Libya. Well, in fact, many of the Chinese students, young college students in China, seem to be realizing, actually, it's kind of if sometimes you have to choose between democracy and stability. Stability is not too bad, right? If you have, kind of, you have to pay such a price for possible democracy through. And in fact, this has also been encouraged by the Chinese authority. They want to remind people, the public, whether you want the turmoil, the prospect of civil war in China in order to attain democracy, or whether you rather wait. And so that eventually, I hope China would be more like South Korea and Taiwan, as the middle class, expands. And people will be, institutions will be built that will be conducive to a mature, a functioning democracy. But a hasty transition through civil war might be counterproductive and might be, ultimately regrettable. So that's kind of I think the sense of the Chinese public today. There are dissidents, but also a lot of Chinese are also mindful of the negative consequences that could come with a sudden, immature transition to democracy.
Let me ask you a question. So the civil war in China today would not be like the civil war in the 1940s, 1930s, and 40s. What shape could it conceivably take? What would be the opposing parties in a 21st century Chinese civil war?
For instance, a thorny problem confronting the Chinese central government today is that, actually associated with the war on terror in the United States. Is pro-independence movement in the western Chinese province of Xinjiang, predominantly occupied by the Uyghurs, ethnic Uyghurs, who, ethnically speaking, look more like the Turks in Turkey than the Chinese, the Han Chinese, which is the majority ethnic group in China. And of course, you have Tibet. And so in both areas, actually, recent years have witnessed quite constant attempts to create terrorist attacks, actually, in order to assert, to give the demands for great autonomy and eventually independence, actually by the ethnic minority people in those two regions. So if democracy were imposed on China today, somehow, for whatever reason, people in those two regions, if given democracy, of course, they would vote. And in the referendum, the people in Tibet and Xinjiang would vote for democracy, and of course secession. And of course, given democracy and the right to vote, the rest of China, of course, would also be given the right to vote. Then the ethnic Han majority group would, of course, vote to stop secession, right? And so, you've got this situation where, the majority in some provinces want independence, and then the rest of the country want them to want to keep them in. And it's reminiscent of the Union and the Confederacy, right? One part of the country wanted to break away, and so that's one possible scenario that would break China.
That's your question? So, but the Uyghurs and the Tibetans must be what, 2% of the country?
No. 2% of the country, but the Uyghurs could be actually more than 50% in Xinjiang province.
I see.
So,
But are there any serious fracture lines within the Han population?
Within the Han population, I also, the only possibility would be the coming back of the KMT, the Nationalist Party in Taiwan, right? If they had enough sympathizers on the mainland, that that would be an eventual possibility. But right now, realistically, no. You see, opposition parties are banned, and so nobody is really in a position to organize against the Chinese Communist Party. And so I don't see that. But you see, given the choice, then things could be pretty messy, right?
That makes me think the idea of stasis is relevant in America, but not China.
It's on this idea about sort of stability and stasis in China. It's interesting that that Professor Sheng mentioned democratic peace theory, and absolutely there's a lot of literature to suggest that if China were to become robustly democratic, that it might be less likely to fight the United States. The example that everybody uses, the big famous example everyone uses to establish this in relation to power transitions, the kind of scenarios we're talking about with the Thucydides trap, is the United States coming of age during an era of British ascendancy. Why did the UK not fight a war against the United States to block the US from becoming the leading power, ultimately the hegemonic power in the world? And the reason typically given for it is that there was an assumption that the United States more or less shared our values, and therefore we as British think that this handoff is going to be manageable, that the United States will respect our interests, that the international order and the domestic norms and practices that tends to promote would be congenial to our British interests. Therefore, there's no need to fight. Obviously, if China remains relatively autocratic and the United States is democratic, the U.S. wouldn't feel that same sense of assurance. And so one might say, well, then the best thing to do is to promote democracy in China. I think we can see from U.S. policy in the last 20 years that the U.S. isn't using all the tools at its disposal to do that. And I think it's because the U.S. government has made the same judgment that Professor Sheng did, which is that it would be very dangerous. Part of the reason why it's dangerous is because of civil war, collapse, calamity in the world economy, refugee flows, a whole host of other problems. But there's another possibility. International relations studies show that while two democracies tend not to fight very often, the transition period between autocracy and democracy is very dangerous. And one of the reasons why is that if you imagine that systems in which the lid has been kept on popular dissent for many years, if that lid starts to come off, how is it that competing political actors try to legitimate themselves and rally citizens around them? Nationalism is often the answer. Look at Russia, look at Ukraine. There are lots of examples of this in which a democratizing state becomes a fertile ground for nationalist anti-foreign sentiment. And so one very real fear is that if China were to open up, let's say, for example, there were a fissure in the Politburo between different factions in the Communist Party, and they started to try to compete. Maybe local elections become more common, and they want to rally people to their side. What are the kinds of issues that they only need to scratch to get people to line up behind them? Japanese Second World War legacy, American encirclement, the Taiwan question, Uyghurs in Xinjiang, Tibetans, the Dalai Lama, Falun Gong. These are all hot-button emotive issues, and we certainly would be concerned about those potentialities leading to interstate conflict. In the U.S., stasis is a problem, I think, for a different reason, which is that if the Thucydides trap is partly about the sense of impending decline of the status quo power, and therefore a sort of nervous response or even overreaction to a perceived threat, what's the fastest way that the United States continue to decline? Spend ourselves into prodigal levels of debt, don't invest in education and in infrastructure, or take other steps to be economically competitive 50 years from now, not to fund the renovation of military assets. All of the stasis that we see playing out in Congress and also in state houses around the country contribute to this Thucydides trap problem because they give a sense, both in the United States and abroad, that the U.S. is actually in a state of decline. A lot of scholars have cast doubt on that. If you look in relative terms, the U.S. isn't in as bad a shape as one sometimes reads in the press. Nevertheless, the stasis in Washington and elsewhere lends credence to this notion that the U.S. is falling. Just like you saw in Thucydides, when the status quo power feels that it's losing ground quickly, sometimes has an impulse to lash out in order to try to preserve its position while it's ahead.
Let me also say, if you have questions, raise your hand, and we have a traveling microphone.
You don't need a mic, since we're all talking along.
Okay.
Yeah, two questions. Of course, I'm taking the risk of exposing my ignorance by the kind of questions I'm going to be asking, but I'll take that risk. One is this theory about, is that democratic peace theory, in the sense Democrats don't fight Democrats, but Democrats will fight China, and autocrats will fight autocrats. I'm wondering if there's enough data to support that, because my theory has been that, my theory has been that especially a powerful Democrat seems to be more friendly with autocrat countries rather than other Democrats. And my reasoning is it's very difficult to, if I want another country to kind of listen to me, if that country is a democratic country, they've got a whole bunch of a parliament or a Congress which they have to be convinced to make the decision. On the other hand, if I can find a dictator, I can just negotiate with the one guy and make that person agree to my way of doing things. So is there any real studies to see if that happens? I'm thinking that if not a war, Democrats and other Democrats don't get along that well, but Democrats and autocrats seem to get along very well. Even U.S. history, we've had in South America, we've always taken sides, and we ended up supporting one dictator instead of another dictator. I don't know, that's one question. That's maybe just a trivial one left. Second one is this theory that you're talking about, U.S. and China, will they come to a conflict because of this? Has the same kind of theory been espoused after the Second World War between Russia and United States? And it didn't really come to that. There was this whatever nuclear deterrent or something. What do the theoreticians say about that?
Shall I go first? Okay, first on democratic peace theory, what the empirical studies suggest and the theoretical studies on this is that democracies get into a lot of marital squabbles but not into brawls. And the reason is that, yes, as you suggest, there's a lot of contentious politics, but in a two democratic governments, the theory says that there's a belief on each side that we can reason with these people because there's a pluralistic system that has peaceful mechanisms for change. So if the U.S. and France get in an argument with one another, both sides feel that there are institutional mechanisms for affecting the other side's decisions. Lobbying mechanisms, democratic mechanisms, possibility that the leader will be voted out of power in the next cycle, and so forth. With an autocracy, the same options aren't available. That's one reason. The second is that democracies, by and large, at least especially in the modern era, democracies are accountable to the people they send out to fight, and autocracies less so. And therefore, it's easier for an autocratic government to commit resources to a conflict than it is for a democracy. That makes it harder in a two-democracy situation to elevate to war. There are a lot of critics of these theories. There are examples like the Americans and the British fighting in Venezuela early in the century, and some others that bring into question whether this is an absolute rule. But overall, the empirical evidence suggests that it is much less likely.
But the point about democratic countries needing the approval of the Congress or something before they send people to war, in most cases, at least America itself, the war in Vietnam and the war in Iraq essentially was initiated by the executive, and then they said, we'll come back and get the permission from the Congress later on. And especially in Vietnam, they just went and stayed there for, I don't know, 10 years. And in South Korea, before that, North Korea, it was a police action. The whole thing was considered a police. So I'm just wondering if people just use a different way of getting into the conflict anyway.
I'd say a few things. One is, if we look at what happened to the Johnson presidency and the Nixon presidency, Vietnam did impose huge costs. So there is an added cost. But I wanted to comment on your second question about the theory of. Can you remind me just a moment with that?
The conflict that you're now asking whether China and the United States will end up fighting each other because of the rise of China was a similar kind of thing made between Russia and.
Yes, that was debated, whether there was an inexorable path toward conflict. This is a chart of this Graham-Allison 16 cases that Professor Vogt mentioned earlier, and that's coded by the scholars as one of the 4 cases of a non-conflict between a rising power and a status quo power. Try telling that to somebody in Angola, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Afghanistan, Cambodia, Vietnam. There were a lot of proxy conflicts during the Cold War, and one of the things that I think is a problem with the Graham-Allison's sort of approach to U.S.-China relations is it tends to focus the Thucydides trap metaphor tends to focus our attention on body blows that are direct between the two major powers, between mutual nuclear deterrence, the diminishing value of land territory in the modern economic arena. That seems less likely. Where I think we would likely see conflict is in peripheral areas where their interests clash, and therefore I think that the Soviet U.S. I mean, the Cold War. Yes, there was an absence of direct tete-a-tete superpower conflict, but there were a lot of people being mowed down in proxy wars around the world.
May I add something to that? I think Hobbes showed how to read Thucydides properly on that point. Hobbes says in Leviathan that war is simply the period in which the willingness to contend by battle is sufficiently known. So you're at war whether or not bullets are flying or not. From that point of view, I think that already is war.
I think we have another question back here.
Since we've said Cold War, I now have to say Orwell. And in Why I Write, George Orwell defined a political action as, in the broadest sense, to try and push the world in a certain direction, in the direction you wish it to take, to the bane of most of the establishment. And by the way, we mentioned about executive powers in democracies taking individual action. I would merely cite the CIA in Chile. Pinochet was necessarily the result of a democracy. Just going to say that. Due to information technology, people across the world are, under Orwell's definition, getting more political. What effect do you see that having on the general trend of major powers to fight wars at all?
Cuban, Mr.
Could you say a question again?
Actually, John, in this case, the microphone didn't help.
Oh,
I think it's actually clear to hear your voice.
oh,
It's harder for us to hear back here, maybe, than it is the way that.
yeah.
It could be.
Room geometry. Information technology is engaging more human beings on planet Earth politically than ever before. To what extent is this going to defray the abilities of the major powers to fight wars against powers? Because broadly speaking, it's always the people who suffer and the nation states which gain from war.
Well, in terms of information technology, you see, I was Just reminded the other day that well, the United States was trying to actually talk to China about this cyber attack, possibly directed by the Chinese military against infrastructure in the United States, information, public officials, etc. And so, well, to the extent that's the case, sometimes, of course, governments use information technology to provoke each other, which would actually make conflict more likely, and information technology becomes a weapon, a tool of state hostile policy toward each other. But you seem to be suggesting that actually, you see, about the social media, right? So the peoples of the two countries are now better connected and are talking to each other more, and there's more exchanges, and 300,000 Chinese students, study in the United States, and probably a lot, many more in the future. American students are going to study in China, and so this probably is great. But I also, Graham Allison in his the article with the title in the Atlantic, right, talking about the Thucydides chart. I think he has a point about on the eve of the First World War, right? No matter how reluctant the King of England would be, to attack Germany, because the Kaiser was his nephew, and the rulers had fond feelings about the other country, right? But sometimes war happens through miscalculation, through accidents, through it's possible, So the answer to your question is, information technology could be used both ways, and then, despite the better connectedness between the two peoples, accidents and other things, strange things could happen that could lead to countries to conflict, even though nobody really wanted war.
Can I ask you a question? Facebook is blocked in China, isn't it?
Facebook is blocked, but other media could be, I think it could be used. I don't know. How about Twitter? I know a lot of Chinese in the United States use WeChat to connect with their Chinese friends. But you see, email. But the point still stands, right? It's so much cheaper to call China, long distance call. When I first came to the United States in 1997, it's about $1 a minute. Now when I call back China, it's 2 cents a minute. And so, it's kind of so that would make communication a lot more, more extensive between the two countries.
I'd like to offer 2 things. I absolutely take your point that communications among people could constrain governments, especially in taking acts that the people would pay for. But there are a couple of things that are worth noting about how information technology interconnectedness can be dangerous in Sino-US relations. One is that the Chinese government regularly sends out its officials into cyberspaces, social media spaces, to foment nationalist sentiment when there's a contentious issue overseas. That's been well studied. I have a co-author who's written a book on this, and it's been happening with some regularity, especially as you would expect in periods where the government is having other challenges: corruption scandal, economic downturn, leadership transition, times when one wants to sort of rally the population. The government can manipulate some of those channels to serve ulterior motives. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that in a Cold War scenario between the US and the Soviets, the thought was that neither side would attack the other because both were deterred by the presence of nuclear weapons at the other's disposal. Deterrence, at least the classical formulation of deterrence, depends on being able to identify that you sent the weapon at me and therefore I am going to punish you. What cyber conflict at least raises the possibility of is attacks where it's not easy to attribute the source. Even if there's technical attribution, there might not be political attribution. In other words, even if you can identify that the cyber attack happened from a warehouse in Newark, New Jersey, or in suburban Shanghai, you can't necessarily identify the level of connection between the government and the agent that carried out the attack. So this is where I totally agree with Professor Sheng's point that you can have miscalculations, and one can imagine scenarios in which either China or the United States perceived itself as having been attacked by the other side incorrectly, responds in kind, and then you have an escalation.
May I ask a question? Thucydides spends a lot of time talking about the national character of the Spartans and the Athenians, right? The Spartans are slow-witted, he says. Slow-witted, they are not keen on innovation, they don't travel much, but they're easily corrupted.
Did you say Michigan State by any chance?
The Athenians, on the other hand, are gregarious and innovative and exploratory, and Thucydides talks not only about how the Spartans were threatened by Athenian character, he talks about how Athenian character, how Athenian culture changed in the course of the war for the worse. That people became less observant of religious forms and practices, how they became more nakedly ruthless, etc., etc. Now, I've had Chinese friends, and my Chinese friends they're not shy about generalizing about themselves and their people, right? And they say interesting things. I think that usually we are trained to be aware of generalizations, that like a specialist is to look beyond and to speak with specificity. But having said that, I wonder, can we generalize usefully? Let me tell you a story. When I was in grad school, I had a friend from the People's Republic of China who were studying together, and he said that when he and his wife were driving in the American countryside at night, if they would come to a stoplight at an intersection, inevitably an American car would be sitting there, the only car in sight, politely waiting for the light to change, and they would fly through it, laughing. And I said, well, that surprises me, because growing up, we were always told that China had an authoritarian government because people were docile. He said, on the contrary, we have authoritarian government because we are unruly. He said, it is you Americans who are docile. Can any useful generalizations be made or not?
I guess my first reaction is to say that it's difficult, of course, in either society to generalize, but one of the common arguments made about why we're not in a Thucydides trap is that both societies embrace business, mercantilism, profit-seeking, entrepreneurial spirit, and so forth, and so that these two great powers have traded more robustly in nominal terms than any two great powers in history. That's not a foolproof way to avoid a war, as Professor Sheng mentioned. Right before the First World War, England was trading robustly with Germany and France, and that collapsed. But it is at least an additional disincentive to fight. And so in that sense, I think that both, I don't want to say all, but many Chinese and many Americans can do business together and see common interests and common values. There are lots of other ways in which there are people-to-people exchanges. I mean, probably at this university, certainly at mine, at the University of Michigan, there is an enormous population of Chinese students. There are also many American students, including some that I'll take to China in May, who go to study in China. Those people-to-people ties mean that if there is an initial sort of difference in I guess we'd say kind of cultural approaches or normative approaches to things, that there are plenty of opportunities to develop mutual intelligibility and mutual respect, because unlike in the Soviet-American case in the Cold War, you've got millions and millions of Chinese and Americans getting to know each other, getting married with one another, going to the same religious worship services with one another, keeping in touch through business connections and otherwise. And even at the elite level, even though there clearly are very different cultures of diplomacy and cultures of how to handle affairs and business meetings, which I used to see in the Treasury Department when meeting with Chinese, there is a meeting almost every month with somebody from the Chinese embassy or the Chinese government if you're an American official, and vice versa. That's a wonderful sort of opportunity to avoid some of this trap, which is to say that there's if indeed differences exist at the outset, there's so much opportunity to learn about one another.
Yeah, great point about the positive cultural interaction taking place between the two peoples and between the two governments. Actually, that's encouraging. But still, that I play in the devil's advocate. Graham Addison would say, that won't rule out the possibility of conflict. Cultural differences won't really be the dominant factor in prompting the two countries to resort to violent, conflict, hostilities with each other. I don't think so. But with your example about your Chinese classmates, defying the traffic light, I think probably I don't know when was that. China has currently a rising middle class. More and more people are buying cars and the like. Just when I was coming to the United States in the 1990s, late 1990s, car ownership was still relatively rare, even in the big cities like Beijing and Shanghai. And so one reason why some Chinese students would ignore traffic. First, of course, you are right that rule of law is much weaker in China, and so most Chinese don't understand, are not aware of the legal constraints when they drive on the road. But the second probably is I think has to do with a lack of experience. If you don't really drive a lot, you don't hear about the importance of stopping at the stop sign. So that's why some people. I think it's just ignorance rather than just innate Chinese cultural trait that would explain their unruliness.
That's a disappointment.
I want to say probably something that might probably entangle the two countries in a direct military confrontation, even though neither side had a plan to do so. Could be a couple of flashpoints in East Asia. One has to do with the lingering territorial dispute between Japan and China that might flare up if, as John talked about earlier, when politicians in both Japan and China had domestic problems and they want to divert domestic attention, so they resort to rallying the flag, nationalism, ugly nationalism. And so because of alliance commitments by the United States, Japan's involvement with conflict with China might drag in the United States. Another scenario, of course, is the recent election in Taiwan that brought back the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, which is a pro-independence political party in Taiwan. And in fact, the overwhelming victory of the DPP can be explained by the fundamental shift in Taiwan public opinion about their, over their sense of identity. And increasingly, people in Taiwan are considering themselves not Chinese. And if this is true, and the fact that Taiwan is a democracy where people vote. So if most people think they're no longer part of China, then they're really not Chinese. So there's a growing likelihood that Taiwan would, even though it has enjoyed de facto independence ever since 1949, they might want to seek de jure independence in the coming years. But the the state policy of China is that, if Taiwan is seeking independence, they will use force to retake Taiwan. And I think that increases the chance that the United States will be brought in due to the Taiwan Relations Act that commits the United States to the protection and defense of Taiwan against Chinese attacks. So if that's true, I see maybe there's this possibility, of a real conflict. See, and you see here, the United States and China don't really want to fight each other, but sometimes things get out of hands. The Japanese took the initiative, or the Taiwanese took the initiative, and so during the previous administration under the DPP, the United States government, in fact, I think under Bush, George W. Thomas Christensen had been working extremely hard to remind constantly the Taiwanese authority not to be too explicit in seeking independence and endangering the security of the United States. So one war concern, of course, is that if the Republican won the White House this year, and if the Republican candidates kept their promises made during the debates, so things could become a bit less rosy for peace between the two countries. So,
Kevin?
I've got a pretty loud voice. So, a lot of the early debate, at least, was about the U.S. doing something because of its decline in power, and it fears losing the crown, so to speak. But one thought that comes to mind is how war between the U.S. and Japan started in World War II. Japan knew that it would have to fight the U.S., or felt that it would have to fight the U.S. inevitably, and knew that it was smaller. It couldn't win if the U.S. struck. So it struck first in an act to try to cripple the larger power. And I noticed that recently it doesn't seem like it's all sunshine and rainbows over China. They're having a lot of economic turmoil and instability going on as they move forward. Do you think that they might do something rash in an attempt to re-solidify, as opposed to us doing something rash in an attempt to hold on to the ground?
I think it's entirely possible they'll do something rash. I don't think it would be a sort of Pearl Harbor take two, but I think they could do something in the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands that Professor Sheng mentioned. It could be over Taiwan. It could be in the South China Sea. And Taiwan is probably the closest analog to that Japanese strategy in the early 1940s that you mentioned, which is that the Chinese government could, in some conceivable circumstance, think that if it acts quickly enough and decisively enough, that the U.S. will be too late to respond, and it'll be a fait accompli, and the Taiwan issue will be decided militarily. And the U.S. has a lot of contingency plans. People in the Pentagon are spinning their wheels right as we speak about how to prevent that eventuality, using the U.S. assets that are deployed in Guam and in the Philippines and in Japan and so forth. The cost to China, of course, would be potentially enormous, but the bet that China could make is that, similar to the bet that Japan was making, that they could keep the U.S. out by knocking out the 7th Fleet in Pearl Harbor and scaring the U.S. into submission, at least for a while. The Chinese government could think that if things are going bad domestically, that they can score an enormous domestic political victory in a way that would make it very difficult for the U.S. to respond in kind. Essentially, they may bet that the U.S. isn't willing to fight over Taiwan, and they may be right, if they were to come to that conclusion. But it's a very dangerous strategy, of course, and so I think it's highly unlikely. I think much more likely is exactly what Professor Sheng was describing, that a shove over one of these territorial disputes by one side becomes a push by another, perhaps not even involving the U.S. Maybe it's Vietnam thinking that the U.S. will come, or more likely the Philippines, thinking that the U.S. would come and defend an ally, talks more loudly. So China sends out some Coast Guard patrols and fires on a Filipino ship. So the Philippine government sends out a ship to fire something that's intended to scare China off, but instead accidentally hits a Chinese ship. Next thing you know, there's a call to Washington. What are you going to do? Are you going to maintain your credibility as a protector of your allies and honor your commitments, or are you going to sit back and allow China to bully its neighbors? Then the U.S. responds. And you can easily imagine situations where the U.S. or its allies put China in that situation. If you're a government that doesn't depend on electoral or democratic legitimacy to govern, but instead on performance credentials, on nationalistic credentials and so forth as bases for legitimacy, how are you going to respond if somebody hits you in the nose militarily? It's very difficult for the members of the Politburo to say, let's step back from this engagement. Those are the scenarios where I imagine that the conflict could erupt. That's why I think in my overall view of the Thucydides trap is that there's not a certainty of conflict between China and the U.S., but there is a certainty that they're going to be rubbing against each other and there's going to be friction in a whole bunch of different areas: economic, diplomatic, strategic. We haven't even really talked about the expansion of China's naval ambitions, which to China are entirely legitimate, wanting to protect the sea routes that are the jugular veins of its trade and its national economic well-being. But the U.S. is used to being the big kid on the block. And so as China expands its naval presence, there's going to be friction. When there's friction, then you get into these little altercations that can spin out of control. That's why ultimately I agree with the policy recommendation that Graham Allison has, which is that there needs to be serious, constant, dedicated engagement between the U.S. and China to be talking to each other strategically at all levels, because opportunities for things to turn into big brawls will occur. And then the question is whether or not the agents that are operating in that structure choose to to moderate their behavior, or whether they choose to indulge in the impulse for conflict.
Other questions?
I guess kind of similarly to what you said about like Taiwan and that being sort of a point of contention. The way I understand it, like North Korea, there's obviously huge U.S. interests, like in the surrounding area with South Korea, Japan, things like that, and also sort of a sense of obligation of China to keep them not necessarily under control, but from kind of causing problems or being like struck down. I mean, do you think that that is sort of a point in which that could bring about conflict?
I think so. I mean, the Chinese government has had at least two, maybe more, big concerns with North Korea for a long time. Number one, refugees. Where are all the North Koreans going to go if that odious government implodes? They're going to go into Manchuria and some areas of China where it's going to cause immense problems for a government that already has a lot on its hands. And number two, if North Korea implodes and South Korean armed forces and U.S. armed forces move up to the Yalu River, there's the potential that you'd have a unified Korea that is allied to the United States with American servicemen standing across the river pointing their guns at China. That's obviously, from a strategic standpoint, that would be a potential sort of dagger in the belly for the Chinese Communist Party. So what will happen, and of course there are already a lot of conversations about this, about what would happen in the eventuality of North Korea collapsing. Maybe the only silver lining to that regime staying in power so long is that the neighboring states have had an awful lot of time to think about how they might respond in the event of a collapse or a conflict. The United States and China need to be on the hotline with one another, discussing, and the Japanese government and South Korean government and Russians, about exactly what forces will move where and what would be the sort of negotiating terms for what a post-war Korea might look like. Nobody thinks North Korea would win, okay, but they could inflict immense damage, which would also be destabilizing. The bigger question is what would happen if there's this sort of destitute, collapsed state and something has to fill the vacuum. There isn't yet a concrete expressed agreement about it, but there has to be continued conversation so that if that comes to pass, there's at least a game plan for how to begin to sort it out.
Just on the North Korean question, there's no question that the North Koreans are more or less, they're hostages right now, and that if released, they would be rewards of the international community. Do you think there's a huge opportunity that could be, you can see, to sort of avoid this, all of this proxy wars between the economic powers. There's a huge opportunity in the let's take care of the North Koreans project that is a coalition between China and the United States and South Korea could undertake that could, in essence, give that opportunity for a lot of communication that you agree with as a policy.
Well, yeah, I think from the Chinese perspective, they would never do it because an independent North Korea, no matter how recalcitrant, even to China, would it be better for China than a unified Korea backed by the United States, directly bordering China. So that's why China has been so reluctant to actually cut off its support, economic support of the North Korean regime. Because a terrible North Korea is better than a situation without North Korea, because North Korea strategically is a buffer zone between China and the United States. The United States is stationing its troops in South Korea, and without North Korea, the United States troops will be at the Yalu River, directly facing China. And so, from that point of view, China would never join the United States and South Korea to take out North Korea, communist regime.
Given that hypothesis, and given the historical trend I mentioned, but do you believe that there are positive incentives for these nations to create autocratic buffer zones between them?
China doesn't really care whether
it's not create, but maybe create, and obviously you're saying that they want to maintain North Korea, but also do you believe that there's also an incentive to actually create that?
You see, it's I think John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago, a famous scholar in international relations, when he talked about, I think, the problem of Taiwan for the United States. And it's the same rationale that would keep the United States interested in China not taking Taiwan. You see, because a Taiwan separate from China is always in America's better interest than Taiwan included as a Chinese province. Regardless of the regime type on the Taiwan island, the United States would try to see when the United States commits itself to the protection of Taiwan. Taiwan was ruled by a dictatorship of the KMT, and so it's the same rationale. You see, to keep your enemy weak by either having North Korea as a buffer zone or have a Taiwan that's separate, not part of China. And so that's the same, I think, thinking here.
I have a quick thought on that, if I may.
Sure. What I was going to say was, if this is wrapping it up in 5 minutes, we'd make this a rather short panel discussion, but it would give us another half an hour to look at the books, and this is the second to last day for the exhibit. Would that suit you two?
Fine.
Okay.
Fine. I think in answer to your question, yes, both. I wouldn't say it's so much about buffer states as states of strategic interest. Why does the United States government soft pedal human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and pile on invective for other countries? Because they have strategic value in the context of the conflict with Afghanistan, and because the other pumps out a lot of oil. The other case in China is that states like North Korea and Myanmar, until quite recently, obviously very high strategic value to China, because both are in positions where the absence of Chinese sway in those countries could be very strategically threatening. And this helps to explain why China invested heavily in those societies. Now, China's government is not pushing sort of liberalization of human rights strongly in any parts of the globe, but is particularly interested in stability in those states that have strategic interests, just as the United States is particularly interested in stability in places where the U.S. has strategic interests. That's sort of, a classic, frankly, an ugly dimension of power politics, but I completely agree with your premise.
Okay, so why don't we close the discussion, but we open the cases, take another half an hour to look at the books that are on loan from Texas. I want to thank you both very much for coming. Very interesting. Okay, thanks very much. We'll reopen the cases then.